Salutations, everybody. It is Matty here today, and we're sitting down to talk about Bethesda Game Studios. It's been a little bit since we've chatted about them. Our last video on Bethesda was talking about the future of this game developer, because I imagined after Shattered Space, they'd go quiet for a while. But following Shattered Space, a lot of people wanted me to talk about Elder Scrolls 6. What's my feel for Bethesda Game Studios moving forward? And I always said it was really defined by how they receive the criticism of Shattered Space and Starfield in turn, where I do think base game Starfield does a lot of great things, but Shattered Space was, I think, a reality check moment for Bethesda Game Studios of like, you can't just check all the boxes that your old games do and expect it to work. You have to understand why those things worked. And I broke that down in detail in my review. But I think that's really what makes the best developers in our industry. Of course, there is talent, and that is a very important piece of the puzzle, but we're humans. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to make bad choices sometimes. And I think it's totally understandable. But when you make those choices, it's about when you have that reflection and you go, okay, what did I do wrong here? What could I have done better? That you take the right lessons from it. And it's also important that in your biggest successes, you take the right lessons from it. This is something I talked about with my video called How Skyrim Ruined Bethesda, which is, I know for my viewers of my Bethesda content, a video I plug endlessly, and I apologize. I know it's tiresome, but the reason I plug it as often as I do is because I think it's a really important video that shows how Bethesda talked about their games before Skyrim and after Skyrim. Well, Skyrim is one of my favorite games of all time. It is also the moment that Bethesda took the wrong lessons out of what people loved from Skyrim and started to pack that into game after game. And even titles that I love, like Fallout 4, suffered from it a little bit. So today we're talking about what Phil Spencer had to say on behalf of Bethesda Game Studios when it came to Starfield Shattered Space and what Todd Howard believes was the problem with Starfield Shattered Space. And I gotta say, the thought process here is disappointing, as I'll illustrate. And they are not, even if I think you love this DLC, taking the right lessons out of the criticism, for better or for worse. So we'll talk about that, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here today to talk about some Bethesda Game Studios. And before we begin, a quick word from today's sponsor. Gamers, you like good deals, don't you? That's why I'm here to tell you about Instant Gaming. You head over here and you can find some of the newest games for insane deals. Whether you're looking ahead at something like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which is already 30% off, and if the price drops before the release, they'll refund you the difference. This goes for anything on this website. What about something more close by that's coming out this year, like Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake? You can get it on Xbox for $60, or Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. If you want the early access premium edition, you can get that for $90, or the standard edition comes for $66. If you're looking for great deals, Instant Gaming is a great place to be. Shout out to them for sponsoring today's video. All right, so I got this information from IGN. The article is titled, Todd Howard wondered if Starfield should have delayed buggies for Shattered Space. In an interview with the GameFile newsletter, Phil Spencer said, "We're always learning," when talking about how to approach expansions, and mentioned a conversation he had with Howard about the release cadence for content. Howard focused in on the buggy, which was surprise released during Gamescom opening night live ahead of the expansion. Quote, "Todd and I were talking about Shattered Space. Starfield is a game I put a ton of hours into and really love. But they've had this thing where they've added features throughout the year, and then they had an expansion," Spencer said. "I think that some of the feedback on the expansion is we wanted more features," and he's like, "Well, should we have waited to put the buggies out?" End quote. He continued, quote, "And so I think you're trying to tune both development effort and the impact of the expansion. And I think there will always be a balance of managing the game month to month, but not every game will do expansions," end quote. This is terrible. I'm sorry. I just got to be very blunt about it. This is terrible. This is possibly the worst takeaway. I know a lot of people were like ganging up on Emil Pagliarulo for his response to Shattered Space, but I honestly think it was more well-measured than what we're seeing here, right? Because this is not at all what the problem was. And I will show in a moment what clearly is the problem, but I'll speak for myself first and then show what the public is saying. Look, the problem with Shattered Space is that it checked a lot of the classic Bethesda Game Studios boxes. You can wander in Shattered Space. You have a cool faction in Shattered Space. Like, you have these things that you expect from a Bethesda Game Studios title. You do have the dialogue, for example. You can choose what to say, and it's not voiced. Like, it checks all of these boxes. However, none of it is done particularly well. I think Shattered Space highlights that Starfield's traversal, I don't think you can reverse the damage that, for example, even the jetpack does. I didn't need the buggy because the jetpack, I use that way more in the buggy. The buggy feels bad to control, and so I was jetpacking everywhere and not touching the ground for minutes at a time and just gliding everywhere. I didn't get a moment to take in the world, appreciate what was there. It was boring to explore. And then when you get there, the end result is poor. As I highlighted in my review, a lot of my big problems with Starfield Shattered Space and in turn Starfield was loot and how it was balanced. In the base game in Starfield, you'd go through the awful digipick system to go through a master lock to unlock some randomly generated weapon inside a case, and oftentimes that weapon wouldn't be good at all. And this is a problem all throughout Starfield. It's a far cry away from finding like the Chillren during the Thieves Guild questline, and it's in an expert lock, and you go inside that expert lock and you actually get something unique out of it because you went out of your way to lock pick through that, to go through all these challenges to get to this piece of loot here. Starfield doesn't really respect your time spent looting. They just think you like loot. And this is something I say stems back to Skyrim. In Skyrim, you had the rare weapons and armor. And I know people loved it because I was one of the leads on guides for finding those weapons and armor. It's the reason I'm here today, is because those rare weapon and armor guides did so well that I kind of had a platform of people who loved Bethesda Game Studios games. And in turn, we started talking about Fallout 4. What did they introduce in Fallout 4? Legendary weapons and armor. What did they bring into 76 afterwards? Legendary weapons and armor. In fact, that's the best loot in the game. And what did they carry from that into Starfield? Legendaries again, right? They got away from the loot that made it good. So it's not even that the A to B wasn't really that great in Starfield. It's that when you got to B and you went through B and got to, I guess, C in the loot, that was awful too. So it never felt fulfilling. But more importantly, I think, is that Bethesda Game Studios are, in my opinion, people will disagree with this, and that's fine. They'll give me my raise your standards comments, and that's fine. Do your thing. I think that they can tell a good story. I think Starfield has a lot of great stories in it. Shattered Space is the opposite of that. And I think the worst criticism that Shattered Space has received is people going, oh, it's more Starfield. I'm like, no, because I think base Starfield is a million times better than Shattered Space. At least Starfield I really enjoyed. And I know it had its problems, but when I was questing and talking to people and getting into the factions, getting into the world, there was something there I was enjoying. There were a lot of problems with it, but I was still liking that. Shattered Space I didn't like at all, and I think that says a lot. But Bethesda Game Studios, the fact that they're going and saying, oh, this free content we were giving you, we should have saved that, given you less of that throughout the year, and instead packed it into the expansion. Yes, expansions can have impact in the terms of like, hey, features being added. For example, you look at what happened with Cyberpunk 2077, and I think they did it really well. You had Cyberpunk 2077 2.0, which basically brought in a whole mess of changes, right? Like, hey, here's vehicle combat. That's a brand new feature. However, that was separate from the expansion, Phantom Liberty. And the expansion, Phantom Liberty, was, you guessed it, just a really great story with reactive choices, a new zone to explore, and new loot. At its core, there was much more there to love. There's a lot of stuff there that's new that you will love about that game, but a lot of it dropped in a free update. And when it came to the expansion itself, I think it was slimmer compared to what was actually offered in the free update alongside Cyberpunk's Phantom Liberty. So when Todd's looking at this and his team's looking at this saying, oh, we could have washed over the criticism by giving you a buggy, it's like, no, I think they're thinking about it on a level of how do you offset negative reviews? Like, oh, well, they'll mention the buggy and this will be a feature and it'll kind of wash over the main story, when the real core of the issue was storytelling and exploration not being up to par with their usual quality. And so maybe these are conversations that happened, but when this is the main takeaway that the face of Xbox is saying, like, yeah, this is what we talked about, it just shows a very clear lack of reflection. And look, don't let me speak for y'all. I'm going to do something that I don't like when most YouTubers do, but I think it's important here. We're going to take a look at some Steam reviews. Like, what are the people saying, right? What are they saying? So come on, come join me. Let's take a look at Starfield Shattered Space Steam reviews. Let's see what people are saying. Okay, so we're here on Steam. I figured, you know what? I can only speak for myself so much. What are the people saying? What is the problem with Starfield Shattered Space for the general public? So let's just read a little bit together. So right here we have one review which says, I've played Shattered Space and some of it is pretty good. However, as an RPG with meaningful choices, it falls flat on its face. You'll join up with several groups in the main game. However, in Shattered Space, you see down here, you join the very religious Varun faction to do anything in this DLC, and that's not a choice matter plot. That is what you do when writing a novel. The rest of the DLC follows this pattern. No choices made really that reflect on your gameplay. They talk about here how the places of interest are all new. That's very welcome. There's several new dungeons, and the new Varun weaponry and armor is very welcome. But start scanning the large number of fauna on the planet, and you'll find they replicated the creature to each biome and just renamed them. That's lazy development right there. So if you like Starfield, you might like this, you might not, but it's best to wait for a deep discount. So this is someone who is just, I think, being even-keeled, not completely pissed off. I didn't pick out any reviews here that I thought were someone like this just says garbage. It's like, Okay, there's just empty criticism there, right? This one here says I wasn't going to go in with a negative review, but the ending is what pushed them over the edge. We won't spoil that here. They do run down some of the good. It's more Starfield if you like it. The city's beautiful, which I agree with. It reminded them of Morrowind, and they love Morrowind. There's a couple of pretty good quest lines, and the new extreme difficulty and mods add some challenge. Meanwhile, they say it's just more Starfield if you don't like it. Got tired of the red colors. It reminded me of Morrowind, but Morrowind's also 20 years old, and the main story is underwhelming. You'll see here that the review comes down to the story. If you're hoping to learn more about the nature of the Great Serpent, its relationships with the people of Varun, you learn almost zero new information, comparing that to the 5-minute museum presentation in New Atlantis, which is a really good one to point out. Terrain looks the same. The game has some good handcrafted areas, but they're all pretty empty with meaningful objects of interest and cluttered visual noise at the same time, and way too spacious than they actually needed to be. So again, just acknowledging, hey, there's some good stuff here, but for the most part, storytelling, choices, underwhelming. Scroll down a little bit more. You see here, this individual is saying it feels like they just cut back a lot of the things that could have made this thing great to save development time. Like, for example, when you do get to House Faroon, you see that the place is mostly destroyed. That happened right before you got there. They say it's a poor plot device. That was a choice to cut that effort down. The opportunity to build a dark, gritty DLC that the main game hinted at was completely missed. As soon as I saw the glowing vortex enemies, I realized this was going to be worse than a poor filler episode of Lex. But yeah, the new world map is tiny and padded out with desert. Most points of interest are copy and paste, and being separate from the rest of the galaxy, they should have created more unique details to the computers, equipment, and signage. Squint your eyes, and you could be on literally any other planet, which is another good point there. If you bought the Ultimate Edition, there's no harm in playing this. It adds some neat guns and includes House Faroon. However, if you're going to buy this for $30, it's best to steer clear, because I finished the DLC and legitimately thought, oh, that's it. Last one here, because before I'm just beating a dead horse. Shattered Space brings a unique allure to the game with its new areas to explore and interesting narrative possibilities. However, despite its initial appeal, it's plagued with issues that impact both immersion and value. The expansion story feels isolated from the broader game. Once you complete it, there's no mention of it when joining the Unity. This is something I talked about in my review. You don't get any sort of ending consequence from it. For such a large edition, the oversight feels like a missed opportunity to add to the depth and cohesion of the multiverse. Content-wise, it feels overpriced. If you're interested, wait for a Steam sale before committing. House Faroon, depicted as a menacing faction, instead feels like a fragmented, misguided collective with limited purpose. Their portrayal doesn't quite capture the intimidating presence they were intended to bring to the game. The loot is unimpressive. The ability to acquire additional copies of Varun weapons is convenient, but it doesn't compensate for the lack of genuinely exciting or rare items. Also, the melee mechanics feel counterintuitive. While Bethesda may have intended to make melee more impactful, teleporting enemies make this approach more frustrating and rewarding. There was also a review that I skimmed through earlier that mentioned teleporting enemies was frustrating. I bought this expansion because I wanted to see where the story would go, but it's clear Bethesda needs a reality check. They need to reevaluate their design decisions and shake off the "it just works" mentality that has grown tiresome. A bit of honest self-reflection and return to quality storytelling would go a long way here. So those are the reviews, right? And I don't look at that. I don't see anyone complaining about the fact that, like, we got a buggy early or that it was missing features. It's that what was there wasn't up to quality standards. What's there, most importantly, was mentioned often, is the story wasn't very good. The story was underbaked. And I think if the story was good, it would have enhanced everything around it. Because if the story's good, it adds flavor to these locations you're exploring. Obviously, the loot is a separate thing, but I hope they can figure that out in a future expansion or future Bethesda Game Studios games. This is a really important moment that I think people are going to find myself and other YouTubers are overselling. But when you look at, in my opinion, my favorite all-time game developer, and the lesson they take out of their worst expansion ever is we should have just saved the buggy. That is a really bad sign of things to come. If they are not taking that moment to say, we could have told a better story. Yeah, we had the exploration, and the exploration's great and all, but we didn't provide meaningful locations for them to dig into. Or the side quests. I mean, if we honestly assess Bethesda Game Studios content, their best content is always the side content. I think of the Dark Brotherhood and Oblivion. I think of all of the side quests in Fallout 3. And despite nostalgia telling me I love Fallout 3's main story, it's those side quests that really paint the world. And the fact that Shattered Space didn't go to the darker areas, didn't offer, at least for me, anything compelling, didn't evolve Andreja's character in a meaningful way, nothing quite like that was found in the DLC. And that's the biggest shame of all, that their usual main strength, which is that side quest arm, was just not missing. It was entirely absent here. But you see people saying like the faction feels kind of stapled on. And when you think of the base game Starfield lore, I mean, it just sold House Faroon is totally different from what we got. So I think there's a lot more to take out of Starfield Shattered Space than we should have just added buggies in with it. Again, because while the buggy fit well with the environment there, I barely used it because it felt terrible to control. It sunk the frame rate through the floor. That was the other thing. The fact that technical hiccups were not addressed at all in this statement about Shattered Space was equally disappointing. It's like, dude, this thing did not run well. I played it on my Series X. It did not run well. Like, you would not want to go in the buggy because you'd go so fast that the game would struggle to keep up with itself at times. And that was also frustrating. I mean, the list is, for me as a diehard fan of their games, kind of endless on the things that they could have done better with Shattered Space. But again, I'm willing to be like, I'm the more chill consumer, I think, compared to what I read online. As in, like, I'm willing to be like, hey, look, y'all missed this one, get them next time. Like, that's where I stem from. But for their first takeaway to be like, the buggy. And not to turn this into a dog pile, but I do have to bring some of Emil's comments into this, which is saying, like, look, they thought it was, like, in a lot of ways their best game ever. That does rub some dirt in the face of people who are displeased. They're more than welcome to think that, and that there is a lot of great about Starfield. And frankly, I would agree with it. There is a lot of great about Starfield, but as someone who loves Elder Scrolls and Fallout, I think those games blow Starfield out of the water. But when you see 2 leaders now from Bethesda Game Studios, those are the major takeaways. Like, I think that, yeah, it's got its own identity, but it's one of our best games yet, and we need buggies in the expansion. That says to me that 2 of their core leaders at the team, of many, in fairness, are taking the wrong lessons out of this misstep. And again, just, I'm speaking from passion. I know a lot of people will mistake that passion for anger or let's hate on them, but it's like, dude, it's sad to watch. This is like my favorite developer. It's sad to watch and see them kind of just step on rakes constantly. So I'm hoping that this video does make its way to Bethesda, that they take a moment just to be like, all right, like, hey, look at the reviews he just showed. Like, people are more displeased about the storytelling and the exploration and the loot than the buggy. No one mentioned the buggy. I don't know anyone who talked about the buggy. It was just like, it was cool that Bethesda Game Studios had a vehicle, and I had all the faith in the world that the buggy would be great because Bethesda just made an amazing space combat game. Like, the best part about Starfield, I always say, is how good the spaceships feel and the space combat feels. They did an excellent job with that sort of stuff. So for the buggies to also underwhelm was kind of disappointing. And again, I continue to get that feeling with Starfield that they're just trying to, like, get Expansion 2 out and be done with this thing. I'm so curious what they do for Expansion 2. Do you delay it a little bit to give it the time it needs? Because Shattered Space did feel a little underbaked. Do you rush it out to just get over it and just move on from Starfield entirely? I'm very curious to see what they decide, but the clock's ticking. And when you're potentially a year from your next expansion and a couple months after your recent expansion released, and this is the main takeaway I'm seeing here from the studio director, it's sad, man. Bums me out. But nonetheless, wanted to offer some thoughts here on what Bethesda Game Studios is going through. And I look forward to hearing from you down below. What do you think of what Todd Howard is saying about Starfield Shattered Space, what Phil Spencer is saying about Starfield Shattered Space? Let me know down below. Other than that, take excellent care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next video. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.